Oh boy. I want to welcome you all. You are at home with the League, and we have a tremendous group coming in. My name is Carol Nadel Van Duzen, and I'm a member of the program committee. And usually our chair, Joanna Leifer, welcomes everyone, but she is on a family vacation. And I am, as we say in the theater, her understudy. So, tonight's program concerns a term we hear used a lot, critical race theory, also known as CRT. What is it? What isn't it? And why is it so controversial? So before we answer those questions and start our program, I would like to introduce Diane Burrows, our co-president, to talk about the League's upcoming programs. Diane?
Great. Thanks, Carol, and welcome everybody. What a great crowd. This is terrific. Thank you all so much for being here. First of all, our major fundraiser is coming up, our breakfast honoring the Black Economic Alliance and their executive director, David Clooney. That's going to be Wednesday morning, March 30th. So check out the website, buy your ticket. If you can't come, make a donation. Or how about volunteering to help out on the development committee? And their next meeting is Monday, February 21st. So join up with them. They could use all the help, and it'd be great to be able to support us in that way. Next, the National League's 102nd birthday is this week, and we thought it would be a great idea to give ourselves a birthday present and let's become poll workers. So take the opportunity, go on to vote.nyc, sign up to be a poll worker. Great birthday present to the League. Speaking of the upcoming election, our Voter Services Committee is heating up, getting ready for this important election season. Their meeting is tomorrow night at 6 p.m. You can register online to attend. And the Criminal Justice Committee meeting is February 24th at 6 p.m. And they are working on TAP. So if you would like to get involved with them, that would be great. Also, today, a reminder, if you live in District 72 in Manhattan or District 60 in Brooklyn, today is the last day to vote in that special election for your assembly person. The polls are open till 9 p.m., so have your coat and your gloves and your scarf and your mittens ready and zip out the door as soon as our meeting here tonight is over and cast your vote. So with that, back to you, Carol. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you, Diane. That's a lot happening. And not only am I thanking you, but I would also like to thank Natalie Silverman, because she's the one that is overseeing this Zoom program. Now, talking of Zoom, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And because we're planning to have a short Q&A after the presentation. So, to begin tonight's program, we are pleased to have first Regina Tillman, who will talk a little bit about what the leagues are doing in the area of racial equality and inclusion. Regina is the chair of the new New York State League's Diversity, Equality and Inclusion Task Force, which is also known as DEI. Regina.
Thank you, and greetings, everyone. As your New York State League of Women Voters third vice president for DEI, I am honored to have been asked to appear before you to briefly brief you on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative at the State League. DEI started to get noticed at the point where workshops were begun, for which I'm happy to say we had several hundred league members participating. For those unfamiliar with our publicly announced aspects of the initiative, we started off in June 2021 with having Krista Grant, Assistant Dean for Intercultural Affairs and Chief Diversity Officer for Student Affairs at Union College, speak to league members at the state convention's opening workshop. She spoke about a new concept of creating brave spaces, and she reinforced the theme of our workshop of us beginning the journey towards a more inclusive and equitable organization. In August and October 2021, we brought in a nationally renowned author and racial justice educator, Debbie Irving, to workshop topics like, I'm a good person, isn't that enough? Which was based on her own journey as she wrote about it in her bestseller book, Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race. The other workshops Ms. Irving conducted for us were on the topics of transformational conversations and how to explain white privilege to a skeptic. We have interjected several 21-day challenges, which is work done for the most part on an individual basis. In November and October of the past year, it was the Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge. And in January of this year, we prompted league members to engage in the 21-day Better Listening Challenge. We initiated drop-in Zoom sessions after some of the workshops and challenges, which occasionally included a guest conversation moderator like Bettina Haywood, who serves on the board of the Massachusetts League of Women Voters as DEI co-chair, and recently was appointed as chair of the diversity committee for the town of Plymouth, Mass. Another drop-in Zoom session is being planned, and a Facebook group has been created and called DEI News and Drop-In Zone. I have a current list of things to do that the task force that I developed will be sharing and accomplishing, but let me give you a little background to all of this activity, how we got to this stage. Back in 2019, I had been talked into taking this novel DEI role, novel for the league, that is, to make such a focus on an executive level position. But a very special woman, a member of your own New York City League, then new president of the State League and a former Shear Fellow in DEI with the U.S. League of Women Voters, Suzanne Stasevich. Many thanks to her for getting the ball rolling. But since I'd been in attendance in the year prior at the League's National Convention in Chicago, thanks to the support of my own league, the Albany County League, I was fully aware that the U.S. League was going to engage in a full court press, so to speak, to become a more diverse, inclusive organization. Their objective was clear: to become an organization that reflected the diversity within the communities we serve. I said yes, and in the early stages of implementing DEI, it was clear that certain strategies would be required to address several current situations, like the need for heightened awareness of disparities in our country and where they came from, past just the TV viewing of protests related to the deaths of young African-American men, women, boys, and girls. Past reading the news reports of threats made to elderly Asian Americans, to Jewish synagogues, and of the caging of brown children from South America. Even the observation, too, of disrespect between one's own league members, essentially trying to address why we are all seemingly stuck in a loop that does not allow progression. Also, situations like the fact that cultural differences will need to be addressed, like the fact that behaviors, policies, and practices within the league need to be reviewed and then viewed through a DEI lens. Like the fact that New York State encompasses a pretty wide area with many people from a wide assortment of backgrounds and circumstances. And like the fact that pushing for educational opportunities would increasingly require a virtual approach, plus funding, plus more hands on deck to drive the call for education throughout the membership. So clearly, some assistance would be critical. You all heard the adage, I'm sure. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thus, it did not take long for the development of a strategy of a statewide DEI task force, now at 17 members strong, representing all points in the state of New York. My congratulations to these folks, several who have gone on to become chapter presidents. Their courage in taking on DEI as league pioneers makes a big difference in conveying the messages of its benefits to their members. And the efforts of task force members will continue to be invaluable as they model DEI to their members and to us all for the foreseeable future. The next major strategy is one distinctly supported by DEI research. That is continuous learning. The DEI initiative is one that requires new knowledge, is ever expanded, as well as awareness growing in support of changing attitudes. The US League had it right in that our relevance in the next 100 years of this organization's existence depends upon expanding its capacity to embrace changes that DEI calls for. That is inclusion of many more different types of people within its membership and key within its leadership, and inclusion and an inclusive environment which allows every member to be heard and accepted for who they are and what they bring to the table without apologies. And an organization that is mindful of where its resources are spent and going past traditional fairness, how equitable our resources are applied. The organizations that do not make the investment in a learning culture, in all that implies, fail at DEI. So, although we got our hands on some pass-through grants from National back in 2020, which we aggregated and found several educators to get learning started at the statewide level, we still need to sustain a learning culture in DEI at all levels. This is not a one and done situation. And I can assure you that all this, I can assure you all actually, that this is not work that is neatly packaged in toolkits and checklists either. It is raw. Disrupting behaviors engaged in for a greater part of most people's lives and attempting to replace them with practices that would appear to do nothing to change the current course of humanity, that requires they engage in from the intellect and from their emotions. Yeah. It also requires that I, leading this effort for New York State, trust in human nature. And as it's said by Dr. Martin Luther King, that I trust in the arc of the moral universe. That, although long, it does bend towards justice. So what the DEI initiative has actually done is to prompt an organic response where members across the state are starting from where they are, not from where I might tell them to be. They come up with their own strategies applied locally to begin making improvements, in making a difference, in beginning the journey toward helping us all to realize an anti-racist and multicultural democracy. Clearly, not everybody holds that vision. You will hear about that perspective in a minute. In the meantime, local leagues across the state have developed their own DEI committees, set up book reading clubs that address the history and the issues of marginalized people, become increasingly responsive to social and racial justice issues surrounding them, including racial gerrymandering and more. The point is that continuous learning tends to better individual and organizational actions. Paraphrasing Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better. Thank you very much for putting on this program and for having me. And if there are ever any questions about DEI, or you just need to bounce out questions or ideas for implementation in your location, please reach out to me. I will be placing my email in the chat box. Thank you all very much again.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Regina. That is amazing. I mean, it's a lot to digest. I think we're on the right track, but it's a lot to digest, everybody. This is being recorded so we can listen again. Now, from DEI, we now go to CRT. And to help us understand critical race theory, we are honored, truly honored, to have Deborah Archer. Deborah Archer is a professor of clinical law and co-faculty director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at New York University of Law. Deborah is also the president of the ACLU and a nationally recognized expert on civil liberties, civil rights, and racial justice. She is also an award-winning teacher and legal scholar whose articles have appeared in leading law reviews. And now it is my true pleasure to welcome Deborah Archer.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to meet with you all tonight to talk about critical race theory, what it is, but also the broader context. And I also just want to acknowledge that my colleague Sandra Park is here and probably knows more about this topic than I do. So if you enter some questions in the Q&A, I might call on her to join me in responding. So to put this in broader context, over the last couple of years, we have been in what many people have called a racial reckoning. And we're beginning to shine a light on practices that are not only part of America's racist past, but really remain central to America's present dehumanization of Black bodies, Black communities, and Black identity. And by calling out the breadth of America's sins against Black people, we as a country were engaged in critical conversations about how to challenge the architecture of racial inequality and finally locate the source of Black America's problems, not in Black people, but in the racism that's woven into the fabric of America. And critical race theory teaches that when it comes to racial justice, progress is always met with retrenchment, and an advance is always met by resistance. Reconstruction led to Jim Crow, the Civil Rights era led to the Reagan era, the election of Barack Obama led to the election of Donald Trump, record political participation by Black voters and other voters of color led to systemic disenfranchisement. So we shouldn't be surprised that we are in a time of resistance and retrenchment right now. If 2020 was a year of racial reckoning, 2021 was a year of retrenchment, and 2022 is shaping up to be one as well. And it is beyond ironic that much of that retrenchment is taking the form of so-called bans on critical race theory, the very framework that helps us understand how and why this process happens. So as this country is forced to confront once again the truth of who we are and how we got here, the challenges to critical race theory have emerged as a nationwide effort to stop and censor conversations about race. It's a social, cultural, political, and legal issue. And before I turn to discuss the legal issues, I want to briefly discuss the larger social, cultural, and political context. In The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, one of my favorite books, he posits that the true racial justice has been halted because white people are in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they can't be released from it. The power of racism rests in part on ignorance. So you can't change what you don't know and understand. And that is the goal of critical race theory, to help us understand. Critical race theory began as a school of legal scholarship that produced a framework for understanding the law's role in enduring racial inequality and the relationship between race, racism, and power, to understand the problem in order to intervene into it and to transform it. And I teach critical race theory at NYU Law School. And there are certain core fundamental elements of critical race theory. And I'll start by touching on a few of the key tenets to help you understand what it is. The first is the belief that racism is ordinary. It's not aboriginal. It is the normal way our society does business and the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Relatedly, critical race theory scholars believe that racism is embedded in the structures, systems, policies, practices, and norms of American society. And that racism results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society. So racism is normative and it's legalized, and it manifests in inherited privilege and also in inherited disadvantage. This is an important lens for the law students that I engage with who are interested in advancing racial justice to use in understanding existing inequalities and examining laws, systems, and existing power structures. Another fundamental part of critical race theory is interest convergence. CRT believes that because racism advances the interests of both white elites materially and working class whites psychically, large segments of our society have little incentive to eradicate it at all. And of course, this is not just about white people. Within people of color, there are varying incentives to fight against certain aspects of racism. An example that is used in CRT scholarship is the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. CRT scholars believe that the motion behind Brown was not that society came to believe in the importance of integration and equality, but that a decision striking down separate but equal would give America credibility as a nation that was dedicated to equality. So some people say that Brown is not an anti-racist decision, it was an anti-communist decision. Another motivating factor people say behind Brown was that it placated Black people by letting them see that freedom and equality could come out of the court, and that docile Black population was better. You don't want people coming home from the war fighting for freedom when they are not free at home. And that would have caused uprisings. And finally, people say that Brown was motivated because segregation was a barrier to industrialization and economic success in the South. It was bad for business. And so critical race theory believes that we are motivated to end racial inequality only when it serves other interests. And once those interests are achieved, like they were with desegregation, the will to enforce desegregation disappeared. And that's why we're in a position today where our schools are more segregated than they were during Brown. The interest of people of color in achieving racial equality will only be accommodated when it converges with larger interests in society or the interests of white folks. CRT also rejects traditional liberal concepts like colorblindness and meritocracy. Law students in particular are often taught that the law is neutral and colorblind, and that it should continue to be neutral and colorblind. And CRT pushes back against all of this. CRT scholars reject the idea of a colorblind society where one's racial identity no longer has any effect on social or economic status. And instead, CRT argues that our laws are not colorblind or neutral, and explicitly calls for a race-conscious approach to transformation. And relatedly, CRT challenges the notion of meritocracy as colorblind or value neutral. CRT scholars argue that the myths of meritocracy are stories told by people with wealth, power, and privilege, that everyone who works hard like they did can also attain wealth, power, and privilege. But they ignore the systemic inequalities that racism creates. And if you examine the role of racism, meritocracy is not only a myth, but it's in fact a vehicle for the perpetuation of race and class-based power and privilege. CRT embraces intersectionality and multidimensionality. They believe that race alone cannot and does not account for disempowerment of Black people and other people of color. And they call for us to be critical of the many oppressions facing people of color. So it calls on us to examine race and sex, class, national origin, and sexual orientation, and how their combination plays out in various settings while still embracing the centrality of race. So this is not being taught in elementary schools. Fourth graders are not reading about intersectionality or the work of Derek Bell or the work of Kim Crenshaw. But now CRT has been recast by Republican activists as an omnipresent and evil ideology that is anti-American and anti-white. And in truth, this is part of a systemic effort to reverse the racial reckoning that I spoke about earlier, to restore the status quo, to recast anti-racism as racism, and to stop meaningful conversations about racial equality. And this, in fact, was the stated goal of this campaign. The Republican activist behind this movement has said, quote, "We have frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand." So rather than engage with the conversation about structural racism, we now have a wave of lawmakers that are seeking to silence individuals, educators, and young people and impose an alternate version of American history, one that erases the legacy and reality of racial inequality and systemic racial oppression. So although the bills that fall under this umbrella are part of a unified effort, they do vary widely. Some of them cover government agencies, some of them cover contractors, some of them cover higher education, almost all of them cover K through 12 education. Together, they are a nationwide attempt to censor discussions of race in the classroom. And these bills don't just set back progress in addressing systemic issues, they also rob young people of an inclusive education and blatantly suppress speech about race. Banning conversations about race in schools also risks maintaining or creating educational environments that are unwelcoming to students of color. All young people deserve to receive an equitable education where they can freely learn and talk about the history, experiences, and viewpoints of all marginalized communities in this country. It also harms the entire student body and really risks sowing the very division that they claim to be avoiding. As the Supreme Court recognized in Brown versus Board of Education, education is the very foundation of good citizenship. And a prohibition on talking about issues of race and racism is a disservice to all students and to society. The ability to discuss and debate ideas, even those that some may find incredibly uncomfortable, is a crucial part of our democracy. And these, of course, are not idle fears. For example, a parents group in one Tennessee school district challenged the use of an autobiography of Ruby Bridges. And for those of you who don't know, in 1960, Ruby Bridges was one of the first Black children to integrate in elementary school after Brown versus Board of Education. The parents complained that in depicting the white backlash to school desegregation, the book violated the state's new law in sending the message that all white people were bad and oppressed Black people. And since January of 2021, 33 states have introduced bills or taken other steps that would restrict teaching a list of prohibitive, quote unquote, divisive concepts. And this list has its origins in a September 2020 executive order signed by then President Donald Trump and includes systemic racism, implicit bias, or limits how teachers can discuss racism or the founding and history of the United States. 14 states have imposed these bans and restrictions either through legislation or through other avenues. And more bills this year also concern curriculum.
Yeah.
Can you just please run
this is live. I have to stop it somehow.
Yeah, but you wasted 5 more minutes. You could have started it for me. I wanted to see it before my 6 o'clock.
Great. So this kind of legislation, example. So this kind of legislation, examples of which were introduced in Missouri and Indiana, require teachers and schools to make instructional material available for parental review and require the creation of alternative lessons if a parent objects. A Florida bill goes one step further, giving parents a private right of action to sue if they believe that their children were being taught critical race theory in school. Using these laws to prevent talk about racism is also anathema to free speech, a right that many conservative lawmakers claim to hold dear. The First Amendment protects the right to share ideas, including the right of listeners to receive information and knowledge. And we must protect this right, including educators and students' rights to talk and learn about race in schools. Similarly, in the university setting, principles of academic freedom protect a professor's right to make teaching choices without government interference. And even with respect to K through 12 education, where states generally have a really wide latitude to determine school curricula, many of these bills overstep the government's legitimate authority. And instead of encouraging learning, the bills effectively gag educators and students from talking about issues that are really of the most profound national importance. This is a blatant attempt to suppress speech about race these lawmakers disfavor. Those who have been pushing these bills have been incredibly successful, and we are pushing back in collaboration with other national and local organizations on First Amendment grounds, challenging the vagueness of these laws, and potential racial discrimination claims under the Equal Protection Clause. In October, the ACLU and the ACLU of Oklahoma filed a lawsuit challenging Oklahoma's classroom censorship bill, which severely restricts public school teachers and students from learning and talking about race in the classroom. And this was the first federal lawsuit facially challenging one of these statewide bans, and was filed on behalf of the Black Emergency Response Team, the University of Oklahoma chapter of the American Association of University Professors, the Oklahoma State Conference of the NAACP, the American Indian Movement, Indian Territory, and a group of individuals. The Oklahoma bill's lead authors in the State House and Senate declared the bill's intent was to prohibit conversations related to implicit bias, systemic racism, and intersectionality, among other concepts. The lawsuit argues that the law not only chills students and educators' First Amendment right to learn and talk about these issues, it is an unlawful restraint on freedom of expression by silencing students and educators' speech through vague and overbroad terms. It also intentionally targets and denies access to equitable, culturally relevant teaching and ideas that reflect the history and lived experience of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. In December, we also filed a challenge in New Hampshire on vagueness grounds to their law that includes language discouraging public school teachers from teaching and talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and gender identity in the classroom. And in December 2021, a new bill was introduced for discussion in the 2022 session that would ban teachers from discussing, quote, any doctrine or theory promoting a negative account or representation of the founding and history of the United States of America. So by attempting to rewrite history, they're really preventing us from engaging in conversations that can help us rewrite our future. And I think it's cynical, it's dystopian, but it's been incredibly effective in setting the parameters of the conversation and shutting down the conversation. So I hope that this was helpful in providing some context to what's going on and a little bit more information about what critical race theory is. And I'm happy to try to answer a few questions.
Thank you, Deborah. I sat here, I don't know about the rest of you, but I sat here kind of angry that this is going on. I mean, we know it is. We saw what happened in the election in Virginia. There was an example where it was used. And I just, after hearing Regina, I am wondering what the League of Women Voters can do. We are considered nonpartisan, but this is a truly partisan issue. Am I right, Deborah? I mean, is it?
Well, I think, the ACLU is also a nonpartisan organization, but I think that fighting for equality, fighting for inclusion, fighting for respect and dignity for all people is not a Republican or Democratic issue. It should be an issue of universal concern. But right now, I think we are seeing these efforts in so-called red states.
Yeah, and kind of one party. Pamela Roderick just wrote this, and I want to say this is horrifying. Besides sending money to the ACLU, what can we do?
So besides sending money to the ACLU, I think there are lots of organizations and groups that are fighting and pushing back as well. And I hope that people will consider supporting local groups and organizations that are on the front lines of pushing back against these laws. I think a first step is educating ourselves about what's actually going on, to breaking behind the narrative that we may hear and the sound bites we may hear on television or read in the newspaper, to understanding the motivation behind these laws, understanding the impact. Like so many other things, it's about getting engaged. Too often, and you are not the group who's at fault for this, who do this. Too often, too many people are engaged in our political process every 4 years, and they're engaged and focused only on the federal level. But if we learned anything over the past 3 years, it should be the power that's not only at the state level, but at the local level, the power that local governments have to shape our lives. So I hope that folks will get involved at school board meetings and in conversations at that local level, because of the influence and power that local government has to exclude, has to oppress, has to divide, and to force us to push back against the forces of exclusionary localism to embrace a more inclusive local government.
By the way, I just have to tell everybody that there will be a transcript of this meeting, so that a lot of this stuff, and when I say stuff, information, you will be able to get and digest in a different way by yourself and reading it and understanding it, which is wonderful.
I see that someone posted a question about systemic racism, and how that term, has been misunderstood or co-opted. I think at the very kind of basic level, systemic racism is the intersecting and overlapping policies, practices, ideas, cultural norms, and behaviors that come together to give an unjust amount of resources, access, rights, and power to white people while denying those same opportunities and resources to people of color. I think that the definition is straightforward, but it's understanding how it works. People want to focus still on the kind of bad apple model of racism, that it's one person who does evil things. And if we kind of catch that person, punish that person, remove that person, we've done the work that we need to do to become anti-racist and to eliminate racism in our society. And I think that kind of framework, which we as a country broadly adopt, ignores the power of racism to persist. And we are, as a result, using tools that are too small to be effective. Doesn't challenge the true nature and power of racial inequality. But our systems are hard to break apart, and it takes time. It's not easy to explain how our criminal legal system has resulted in such disparities in one sentence or two sentences. It's not easy to explain how redlining and the GI Bill and all of the systems that we use to segregate our communities results in the inequality we see today in communities of color around the country. Or Pete Buttigieg got into a lot of trouble when he said that racism was built into our highways. And he's right, that when we built the interstate highway system, those highway builders were motivated in so many parts of the country by racism to remove, destroy communities of color. But it's a long story and people don't want to hear the full story. They don't often have time for the full story. So another thing I think people can do is to spend time educating ourselves about the many faces of white supremacy and the way that systemic racism persists and fuels the kind of racism and inequality we see today.
There's an interesting comment on the chat, and I wonder what you feel about that. The current situation may have an unanticipated outcome. Ironically, it seems that the efforts of some of the legislatures and school districts and individuals to stifle a real and factual reporting of the history of this country has increased dialogues about issues of systemic, and institutionalized racism.
I sure hope so. I sure hope so.
The league is doing it, you know.
Yeah, certainly before this, I don't think people outside of law schools and colleges and universities were talking about critical race theory. So it's an opportunity to increase education about these issues. But I think, you know, there are some, it may be regional. And in New York City, I think certainly we've increased these conversations. But in certain parts of the country, I think that they have been stifled. That there's part of the intent, I think, of some of these laws was this chilling effect, that legislators knew that they were illegal and would be challenged eventually. But in the meantime, we have teachers and professors who are afraid to talk about race in their classroom. They're afraid to celebrate Black History Month. They were afraid to assign certain books about Martin Luther King to celebrate the holiday. It is having an incredible stifling effect for some groups, a chilling effect for some people. And in other parts of the country, I think we're having even more robust conversations. I hope that the balance can tip towards the more robust conversations like the ones that you all sponsor and engage in.
Do you have any, this is another question that someone asked, do you have any examples of effective systemic reforms that have taken place either here or in other countries?
I don't know what systemic, what people would call systemic reforms. I think we are seeing really powerful ways to attack systemic inequality, but that's not, you know, I think part of the challenge is that when we look at systemic problems like racialized police violence, people think that there's one lever to pull and we're going to fix that system. Oh, if we could only find that one lever and then pull it. When in reality, the racialized police violence that we have all seen on television and witnessed on videos is the coming together of a lot of factors, right? It is about racial segregation and the way that we create communities of color that are hyper racially segregated. And then with the way we impose narratives on that community that make us believe that they are super violent and are in need of policing. And then we overrun them with police so no one can move without running into the police and violating a law. It's a question of employment and economic opportunity. It's a question of homelessness. It's a question of our failure to deal with mental illness and help people who are experiencing mental health crises. It's a lot. And so we need to fix all of those individual systems before we can say that we have engaged in systemic reform. So in the area of policing, I think that we're making progress. We are having fundamentally different conversations than I ever imagined possible, right? 5 years ago, I wouldn't believe we were having conversations about how to fundamentally reimagine public safety and support communities through a different model of health and community safety. So we're seeing some changes there. I mentioned infrastructure and what we are seeing around that. We're having fundamentally different conversations. We are seeing in communities around the country, we're tearing down highways that destroyed Black communities, trying to weave those communities back together, trying to reinvest in those communities. That's the kind of systemic change I think is going to lead to long-term equality and equity.
I'm looking at our time. Marty Midori said, the final chapter of The Sum of Us by Heather McGee has very specific suggestions for individual and local action. She recommends the book.
Absolutely, I recommend it as well.
The same. And Mary Jenkins said that the education committee of our local league has been fostering civics education in our public schools. How important is that to support quality and equitable civics education? I think that answers itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that you all are doing that work. It's incredibly important work.
And Gladys asked, are there campaigns for school board elections?
Yes.
Wow.
There are. My family lives in Connecticut, and over the summer there was a particularly contentious election for school board in Guilford, Connecticut, all around the issues that we were talking today, with some school board member candidates saying that they should stop talking about race and that it was harming white children, and the other slate of school board candidates campaigning around the need to have more inclusive education. And so there certainly are campaigns. And I have found in looking at some of these campaigns that people are quite open about who they are and what they intend to do, but you have to look behind the slogans, because the folks who were trying to eliminate inclusive education were using kind of liberal, progressive buzzwords that made folks misunderstand the true intention of what they were doing. So I think you got to pay attention.
And be aware of it.
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions? I find it's new for me to read from the chat questions, so I do. Do you have one?
Someone recommended Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. I think that was wonderful. If people are looking for books to understand systemic racism and systemic inequality, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein is wonderful. Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns is also powerful. Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic, is always a powerful read, and I would recommend looking at that as well.
Well, wow, there's a lot. And again, you're talking in a way to the converted, but it's the converted that goes out there and registers people and are involved in terms of making this a better world. And we're obviously doing it with DEI.
Yes. And I think conversations with the quote unquote converted, or people who care about these issues, is incredibly important, because we are not all born with these tools to engage in the conversation. And we all can't be experts on everything. And I benefit from being in environments all the time where I'm learning from my colleagues, from their conversations, from their research, from their study. And so I'm always happy to engage with folks and share the knowledge that I have, so that we all can be informed as we engage in this struggle together.
And I also think, as I had said, that my background was casting and so forth. When I watch television commercials and shows, what a difference of the world we have. We see that. Now, whether they're banned in certain places, I don't know. They were at one time, but I also see it with children on the street playing together. But then I live in New York, so.
I think that there's another comment about the 1619 Project. Speaking just in my own individual capacity, I think that the 1619 Project was and is an incredibly powerful tool for us to understand racism in this country, and to understand systemic racism, how it's embedded into our systems and structures, and how the inequality, the theft of life, the theft of dignity, the theft of labor that started with chattel slavery continues on to today, and why we cannot achieve racial equality. And so I think it's powerful. And CRT is the ban on CRT is a reaction to the impact that work had. It creates uncomfortable conversations for some people. It's hard to come to the reality that the beliefs and narratives you hold about who this country is and our founding, that what you've been told is not the exact truth. And it's hard to grapple with that. And I think people have been resisting that. But I thank Nicole Hannah-Jones for that incredibly powerful work, for all of the scholars who engaged in the work of really unearthing and revealing the infrastructure of racial equality, so that others of us can go about doing the work of tearing down that infrastructure of equality and building something stronger that can help us lead to a more racial equitable society.
Oh, well, I guess our time is up. I'm looking at you, 5:58. But oh dear, I just, and I know I am speaking from everybody, for everybody, when I say that I want to thank Deborah Archer and Regina Tillman for what they do, what they are about, and for coming and sharing with us today. It just was terrific. Also, I want to say, which really goes along with everything, on March 15th, which is next month, the Ides of March, the program committee is going to be working with the League's Criminal Justice Committee to present a program discussing, and here we go, the urgent need for criminal justice reform in New York City. So this meeting is certainly a terrific meeting to go on to the next meeting. And I thank you all for coming.